Are we ever going to find out if the piggy made it? I don't know. But we are having barbecues this summer, and so that might be a hint. I don't know. Sometimes people are surprised when they learn this about a church. And I would say any church in America, or maybe a lot of other places too, but certainly our church in a big way. When we have a church here on a Sunday or during the week also, we have a lot of children in our building during the week, but certainly during kids camp week and all those kinds of things, what would be your first guess as the most important thing that we care about? What would be the first prayer that we would have? Some people might assume, and of course you would assume this, right? We're a church. That we would be praying for God to make himself known to the kids, or for God to be able to speak through the volunteers, the speakers that are make connections and things like that. While that is true, our first prayer and our first action is for the safety of our children. That is a huge obsession with us here at this church. Nothing bad has happened. And we're going to keep it that way. If you would look around and notice the security that we have here, we care a lot about that. We are on top of things. We have people during the church service that are walking around, not participating in the church service like we are, but they're walking around keeping their eyes open, making sure that everybody is safe, that nobody is somewhere where they shouldn't be, that we know who is here, who is there. And so that used to not be like that. Certainly in my lifetime. Of course, I'm old enough, we didn't have wheels when I was born. But that's been a change. It's been a recent change. And what the core problem is, right? The core issue is that society has changed in such a way that it's created a fear in us of who might be out there planning or planning against us or scheming against us. And what can we do to create a defense against that? Every single parent here is obsessed with the safety of their children. That's something we watch. We don't trust very many people, if any at all. We want to know what's going on. We have these big pictures. That's how we are here too. And it's all from a posture of fear. It's always what could happen, what's going to happen. So I want to share this message today. And we're continuing in the series about miracles, the miracle of protection. The amazing thing that God does to protect us. Protection is nothing new in the Bible. It's from the very beginning and it continues all the way to the end. The promise is that God protects us. What's the difference between followers of Jesus and people who don't know Jesus? The difference in this area, people who are followers of Jesus, they know that they can pray to God, they can ask God, and that God will protect them, that God will protect those that they pray for. God will protect us in a scary world. God does pray. That's the big difference that we have. We've had our student pastor now for about a month, and Pastor Joaquin told me the most fascinating story of when he was born. And I want to share this story. He's doing the junior high group right now, but we have him here through video, and I want him to share his story about how God protected him.
Hey, I'm Joaquin. I'm the new students pastor here, and excited to share a story with you about God's protection. When I was about 6 months old, I actually got sick for about a whole year. I was just coughing up mucus constantly. I couldn't sleep at night. I just kept nothing but staying in my body. And so my parents kept taking me to all the doctors. I ended up at the top hospital for children in Stanford, and they just couldn't figure out what was wrong. They thought maybe it was like some rare disease or rare like type of leukemia, and they just basically told my parents that they had no answers, that they should make peace with that I was going to die and just enjoy the little time that they had with me. And so at that moment, my dad ended up praying at night, God, just give me an answer, right? You know, like, my son suffers so much, like, what can we do? Can you heal him? And so the next night, I was coughing up all night, my dad couldn't sleep, and so my dad's sitting there, and he sees a book calling to him. And so it's a book about building chimneys, and so as he's reading it, there's actually a disclaimer in it that said the chemicals in the fireplace and logs can actually cause sickness in infants. And so as my dad seen that, he covered up all the fireplaces in the house and stopped burning anything, and he realized God was giving the answer. And so here I am today. I obviously survived, lived, and God not only used that wisdom to instruct my dad, but he actually gave me all the physical strength back. I was able to do all these things, serve in the military, do everything that nobody ever thought a little kid that was that sick would ever be able to do. And it was all based on God's protection and what he wanted me to do in my life.
I loved hearing that story. Joaquin explained that it wasn't very much long after that his dad had returned from Vietnam. And his dad was not all that close to God at that time. But his son's illness, his son's impending death, left him in a spot where he had nowhere to go, nobody to speak to. And doctors couldn't help him. And they said, just, like Joaquin explained, just go home and wait it out. And he did not go home and wait it out. He went out and cried it out. And he said, God, if you're there. And isn't that amazing? I've had those experiences where God's just pushed me to something that I had I didn't even want to go there because it just made no sense. But then that turns out to be the very thing that is answered. His dad was pushed to a book on building chimneys. What does he even own a book on chimneys for? Isn't that crazy? But there it was. And it was the fumes from the logs. And that saves you a lot of money in the hospital, I'll tell you that right there. That was good stuff. But what does it teaches us? It teaches us that when we find ourselves in trouble, God has already created a plan of rescue for us. Now, what is protection? Does protection mean nothing bad ever happens to me? I think that's the way we would all like protection to be, right? It means that God's never going to let me get into trouble, or I'm never going to be afraid. No, that's not what protection is. That's great when it's that side of it, right, when it includes that. But very many times, protection also very much more means that we are going to be protected from that which would kill us, that which would throw us down, that which makes us a victim of the circumstances. God protects us from those. God, it's a careful game God has to play. Because a lot of times the very things that we think are bad that are happening in our lives are the very circumstances that God is using to move us into a different place for a much better life, for a much bigger blessing. And so God has to kind of finagle and play this game with us to say, okay, here we go. Don't be afraid. I'm watching over you. And what do we have to do? We've got to learn in our relationship with God to say, God, I know you've got this. I know that you've got a plan. I know what you're doing. And, so many of us, we love Jeremiah 29 and 11. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord Almighty. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. That is so important for us to embed into our hearts and into our minds, right? As we think about the situations, the circumstances that we're in. We see problems ahead. God sees a plan ahead. God sees a rescue ahead. God sees it working out ahead. Just like when Noah was there with all the bad people and nothing was going right, and God says, I'm going to send a flood. When God planned on destroying everybody on earth except Noah and his little family, God had already begun to tell Noah, build a boat. Build a boat. Build a big boat. As far as we know in history, that was the first boat ever built. I don't know, but probably. And God had already started to work that way. When Jonah was having a hard time with God, said, I don't want to go your way, and he goes the opposite direction. He's crossing the Mediterranean. What does God do? God moves upon his heart. And for Jonah, why wouldn't he have said, oh God, it's too late for me to turn back now. I'm halfway into the ocean. I'm out here in the middle of a storm. What am I going to do? Not to worry, Jonah. God had already sent a fish for a long time before, planned for his big fish to be there to rescue Jonah. When the Israelites were up against the Egyptians, they had fled out of Egypt, and they were running as fast as they could, and they got to that sea. And so they've got the Red Sea on one side, and they've got the Egyptian army coming after them on the other, and there they are right in the middle. Oh, they were afraid. Oh, my lands, they were so worried about what was going to happen. And every reason to be, until they realized that no, God had already made a plan for them to create a dry path right through the middle of that water. And there they went right through. And let me ask you today, sometimes we get some really bad news when we're at work, and it's not good, and we're really nervous about it. What do you do in those moments? Do you just sit there and say, oh no, this is the end of my life. I don't have any other way to go. Or do you, like followers of Jesus, have learned over the millenniums to stop and say, God has a plan for my life today. This is what you've done, but wait till you see what God's done. I know that this is what you want to do, but my destiny is not in your hands. My destiny is in God's hands. And how about when that day comes, we sit there and say, okay, God, you've got this. You're going to see me through this. When the doctor gives you the most devastating news, is that a different situation? It's not in any way whatsoever. God is going to be there to carry us. God has a plan to see us through every circumstance and every situation. Some person breaks your heart and sends you off, into oblivion. God has a plan. Don't despair. God knows what he's doing. It is important for us as followers of Jesus to turn around and to recognize that it's not our problems that set the direction of our lives. It's God's presence in our lives that sets the direction for our lives. Our hope is not in good circumstances. Our hope is in the presence of God. That's where we are. That's where we land as children of God. That's who we are. That's who we are. That's where God brings you and me to. And in the Bible, there are so many stories of people getting into terrible problems. But God always has a plan. One of the most prolific people who got into trouble all day long was the Apostle Paul. And what didn't happen to Paul, right? What didn't happen to Paul? And I would say any of us, if we were with Paul, we would not be encouraging him. In fact, we would be discouraging him. We'd be saying, Paul, this is horrible. Paul, he ministered for about 15 years. 6 of those years, where did God have him? In prison. Is that helpful to doing God's work, to be stuck in prison? And what did Paul say? Did Paul, unlike me, did Paul say, oh God, what's wrong with you? Obviously, you've forgotten about me. Obviously, you don't need me anymore. Obviously, any kind of trust I had in you was misplaced. No, that's not what he said. And we don't even have to wonder or conjecture what he said. We know exactly what he said because he wrote it down. And you can read what he said in Ephesians and in Philippians and Colossians and Philemon. What did Paul say? And all through those books, I rejoice in my suffering. I rejoice in my suffering, in hardships and trials and difficulties. And when I am weak, then I am strong. All the way through, Paul made sure that he was in God's presence. And as long as he was in God's presence, he was in God's hand to protect him. He was enjoying the protection of God. At one time, and you can read about this next, at one time, there were so many people that wanted to kill Paul, they all got together, and they made a vow among themselves. Isn't this crazy? These hitmen made a vow among themselves, 40 of them, that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. Boy, that's not good. That would make me very nervous if 40 gangsters had done that, about me. I don't know what I would do. But there was Paul paying no attention to it, knowing that God was protecting him, that God was guiding, that God would spare his life, that God would watch over him as long as what had to happen in God's agenda was going to happen. Paul had no doubt about that. We don't know what happened to the 40 guys. If they kept their oath, we do know that they would have died of thirst. So that's one option. If they didn't keep their oath, well, I don't know. They probably went back and had, supper. But regardless, they didn't get to kill Paul. Nothing happened. One time, Paul was on a prison ship, a Roman prison ship. What a horrible place. A prisoner in Rome was already guilty. Not like the United States. When you're in prison, you're already guilty, and that's the end of it. And if a ship has any problems, well, just sink the ship with the prisoners on it. Let them all die. That's how it has to be. That's the best thing that could happen. Well, the ship got destroyed in a storm. And Paul, he survived that. He survived that. Ended up on this little island, and he found his way there, and he goes to make a fire, and some of the people who lived on it came out to see him, said, what's going on? And they were there to witness when he went to get a piece of wood, and a viper came out and bit his hands, a deadly viper. And they said, oh, that's the end of this guy. He must be guilty of some crime because the storm didn't kill him, but God still made sure he died. God bit him with a deadly snake. So they just sat back waiting for Paul to die. Did Paul die? No, Paul didn't die at all. He just kept working. He kept working. I think inside of Paul's mind is, well, I'm here doing God's work. When God wants to bring me home, thank you very much. I'll go home. But until then, God's going to protect me because I am in the presence of God. Here I am with God right here and right now. That's what we have with Paul. And what do we gain from it? We gain this by watching him and learning from him. When Paul was at the very end of his timeline, when life was about to end for Paul, it was going to end in a very violent way. He had been arrested again for making trouble, getting people who didn't believe in Jesus all mad. And they had figured out a way to get this all the way to Nero. Anybody remember Nero? Nero was a bad hombre. And Nero said, yeah, I'm going to be done with you. I'm going to behead you. We're going to be done. Take this thing away. And Paul said, yeah, you probably are. You probably are. And while Paul was waiting for his, eventual beheading, soon beheading, Paul's friends didn't gather around. Paul's friends read, the writing on the wall and said, oh, this isn't going to be good for Paul. This would be a good time for us to get out of here. This would be a good time for us to get as far away from Paul as we can so that we're not included in this beheading like Paul is. We don't want to be associated with him. So let's just get out of here. And Paul found himself all by himself. And so what does he write? And so we have it here, one of his last things that he ever wrote. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 17 and 18, he says, but the Lord stood at my side. Nobody else did. But the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all the Gentiles, those are people who are not Jews, those are like people like us, and all the Gentiles might hear it. And look what he writes at the very end of that phrase. And I was delivered from the lion's mouth. And I was delivered from the lion's mouth. Paul had been delivered from the lion's mouth time and time and time again. Lots of times we are delivered from the lion's mouth ourselves. I've been delivered from the lion's mouth many times myself. And I have no other thing just to thank God for it. I would say every day that I drive on the 101, it's being delivered from the lion's mouth. I've had some really close calls in the 101. I wonder if that's the way I'm going to go. I don't know. But boy, it's a dangerous place to be, and I have to spend a lot of time on it. That's just the way it is. But man, I've had scary things in the 101 happen all the way through my life. One of the funnier instances I had when I was a little kid, I was in 6th grade, and I was in Mrs. Scott's class. And there was this crazy, weird kid in my class. I don't know, in the old days, we had crazy, weird people. I know you guys don't have those anymore today. But in my day, we did. And the craziest and the weirdest and the ugliest and the biggest kid in my class, his name was Eddie. And one day near the beginning of the year, Eddie, just out of the blue, Eddie was a horrible, horrible, violent bully. Eddie said, Greg, on the last day of school, I'm going to beat you up. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know why. And my thought was, I'm a nice person. I make friends. By the end of the school year, Eddie will have completely forgotten about that, and I'll be okay. Oh, was I wrong? Eddie, committed to memory every day, and he would say it just about every day. Yeah, on the last day of school, I'm going to beat you up. And he would say it over and over and over. And I kind of got to believing it. On the last day of school, Eddie, big fat redhead Eddie, he had been back like 2 grades, and he was oh my gosh, what a mess. And he's going to be. So on the last day of school, on the second day of last school, everybody told me, Greg, tomorrow Eddie's going to beat you up. And I was okay, I guess so. And I didn't know what to do. And so what I did was I said, Dad, can you pick me up on my last day of school? And my dad said, yeah, I'll be happy to pick you up. And I said, Dad, you cannot be late. And I want you to park right here. And I told him exactly where, because I had my exit route. I want you to park right there. But let me tell you what, my dad is always late. And so I knew that wasn't going to work. But, it's all I had, right? And so I asked him to be right here on that last day of school. And I prayed like crazy. Oh, God, help me with Eddie. I don't know what I'm going to do. How I'm going to escape big, fat, ugly Eddie. And but on that last day, I couldn't believe I couldn't believe my luck, what happened. It was amazing. The last day of school, we're all there in Mrs. Scott's class, and Eddie gets mad about something, and he goes completely berserk in class. He throws his desk over, and he runs up to Mrs. Scott, and he hits her, and I tell you what, you don't mess with Mrs. Scott. And man alive, she came back and walloped him. Those are the good old days when teachers could do that, and I miss those days. And next thing I know, in comes a school security, and they grab Eddie, and they escort him out. And I'm like, oh, my gosh, look at that. How wonderful is that? And, I just kind of took a deep breath, and I walked all the way out. I wasn't popular by any means, but I didn't know how well known I was. Because all the way down that crowded hallway, people said, you got lucky, Gates. You got lucky. I don't know how you got so lucky, but you got lucky. Yeah, and I walked out, and there was my dad. I didn't even, my lands. Okay, and then I got a ride home. I never got a ride home. Man, that was a nice day. That was funny. But I tell you, that's what God does. You can pray, and God protects us. I had another goofy time. This is really funny. When I lived in Brazil, I would want to go to youth camp, but we didn't have a youth camp anywhere near us. So I'd have to get on a bus, and I'd have to travel 10 hours to get to a youth camp. And I loved it. I loved getting away. Those are in the days when parents didn't care about the safety of their children. And so off I go. I'd get on these buses, and they're cheap, and off I go. And we're on our way. And what happens, these buses would travel overnight. And every once in a while, every few hours, they would stop at a gas station. And these gas stations were all ready for these buses to stop. And they served, grilled cheese sandwiches and all kinds of little snacks and whatever, coffees. And then you'd get out, do whatever you have to do, go to the bathroom, get back on the bus, and then they would take off again another few hours. And usually I just slept through the whole thing. And my favorite seat on the bus was right up front. I always liked the front seat and the window there on the right. And that's where I was seated, and I had a guy sitting by me, seemed friendly enough to me. And so we got to one of these gas stations, these bus stops, and everybody got out of the bus. And I got out of the bus, and I went there, and I ate, my little Brazilian food that I always liked, and I was having a good time. We get all back on the bus when a lady screams. She goes, my purse is gone, my purse is gone. And then next somebody else says, oh no, my suitcase is gone, and this and this. Somebody had gotten on the bus and stolen everything that people had on the bus. Well, let me tell you the good part. The guy next to me all of a sudden yells out, my gun is stolen, my gun is stolen. Like, you had a gun? And yes, he's complaining. And then he looks to the back of the bus. And there was this guy that he had been talking to all night in the back of the bus. And like an idiot, he yells out to him, do you still have your gun? And the guy, yeah, I got my gun. Well, criminals are dumb. The rest of us are not. And we quickly realized these two guys are going to rob us. That's why one was in the back and one was in the front with a gun. One of them got their gun stolen. Now they can't rob us. They were all upset. And you know what the bus driver did? He wasn't dumb either. He drove right through that city, right up in front of the police station, jumped out, and in a matter of moments, the Brazilian police ran onto that bus, grabbed the guy next to me, went to the back, grabbed that guy, and took him off. And as soon as they got off the bus, our bus took off again. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, thank you, Lord. Thank you that I didn't get robbed. Thank you that worked out really well. This could not have ended well. And I don't know what's wrong with my life. I have so many of these little stories like this. And all the way through, I got to tell you, it's God. God protects those. God protects us. I always had a mother that prayed for me. I always say that. I'm sure my dad prayed for me once. I don't really know. But my mother prayed for me. I do know that, right? We just say that at least. My mother prayed for me. I don't know. But God protects us. God protects us. That's so important in our lives to realize, so important for us to remember. And I'll come here with this thing, where this goes to. Where it goes to is the amazing and incredible power of prayer. The amazing, incredible power of prayer. That when you pray for the protection of somebody, that God actually does protect them. I pray for the protection of my boys, but let me be clear. I don't pray that God would just protect them from being a victim. No. My prayer is a little bit different. My prayer is assuming on the offensive side. I'm not somebody who wants to sit back and wait for something to happen to me and hope that God protects me as I'm sitting back. No. I'm one of those that wants to storm the gates of hell. I'm one of those that wants to get up and make a difference in the world. So when I pray for my boys, I pray for their success. I pray for their motivation. I pray for them as they battle the forces of evil that are out there. I pray for them as people come against them and to tempt them. I pray that they will lead those people to Jesus, that they would make a difference in the kingdom of God. And when you get out there and you're doing something for God and you're doing something to make a difference in the world by God's call upon your life, what's happening? Very clearly, you are coming, you're beeping quite loudly on the devil's radar. And the devil's saying, oh boy, well, I got to stop this guy. I got to stop this lady. We can't be having this kind of stuff against, my control, my authority here. And you know what we got to do against Satan? We got to pray for the protection of people. We got to pray for the protection of our children. We got to pray for the protection of our friends. We got to pray for the protection of our church family. Boy, a church is number one on the devil's target list, because the church makes such a difference in the world in so many ways. Not only do we do all things together, but also how we work individually in our places of work. Boy, the devil doesn't like that. So we got to get together. We got to pray for each other and hold each other up, that God would protect us and that God would help us, that God would help us to move forward as we do the work of God, that we would not step away from that we would not shy away or step back in fear, but that we would step forward in confidence and in trust of who God is and what God is going to do, believing that God honestly answers the prayers of those of his children, praying for the protection of ourselves and protection of others. You can pray for the protection of others, and God will hear your prayer. God will hear your prayer, and God will move in amazing ways. It doesn't matter where the people you love live. It doesn't matter. God goes there wherever they might be, at a great distance or right next to you. God will protect them. God listens to our prayers, and God's will is done. Pray for people. Have the confidence. Some things never happen because somebody didn't pray. Isn't that sad? Some things never happen because somebody didn't pray. Don't let that be you. I hope that's never me. Get in there and pray. Pray for things to happen, for God's will to be done in people's lives. That's where we've got to be. To look for God's presence in our lives. One of many people's favorite stories of Jesus is when they're out on the Lake of Galilee and a big storm comes up and Jesus is sleeping in the back of the boat, and the disciples are screaming their heads off, oh, we're going to drown, the boat's going to capsize, what are we going to do? And they look back at Jesus, who's supposed to be their leader and helper, and he's like, sound asleep. And all of a sudden, they put two and two together. And where they go with this is, he doesn't care about us. I'm sure he's not going to sink, right? But we are. So why doesn't he care about this trouble we're in? Why doesn't he care about the problems we're in? And so they wake Jesus up and say, why don't you care about us? We're about to die. And what is Jesus' response to them? Oh, you of little faith. Oh, you of eensy, teensy, weeny, a speck of faith. Your faith is like this big. That's how big your faith, guys, is. It's tiny, tiny, tiny. So instead of asking, where's our faith, where's our trust, where's our belief in God, they instead went right to, God doesn't care about me. Let me tell you what, I can relate to that. Because many, many times in my life when I've been afraid of something, where do I go? God doesn't care about me. God's forgotten about me. And what's God saying in the midst of it? Really? That's where you went with all this? After everything I've done in your life? After I saved you from big, fat, ugly, redhead wedding? After all the times I saved you from that guy with a gun on the bus? After all the times I've saved you? That's where you're going to go? God doesn't care about me? You little gray, you got the teensy-weensy little speck, tiny little speck, nano speck of faith, don't you? That's pathetic. I don't know where you can find that in the Bible. I'm sure it's there somewhere. But that's where people go, right? What do we got? We got to step back and say, oh no, God, that's so true. Help me not to go and lie and believe the devil that you don't care about me. Instead, help me to stand up and help me to have faith in you, to trust you and believe in you. Well, what Psalm 34:7, what does it say? And the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he will deliver them. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he will deliver. Isn't that amazing? That's where God is, that he dispatches his angels to surround you and to protect you. Things that you can't see, things that you're not even aware of. Yet God has already taken action to protect you and to watch over you in ways that you cannot even quantify. Only when we get to heaven and we have these blinders taken off and God opens up our eyes will we see, oh, God really did care about me. I should have had a whole lot more faith than I did. God was good. You can step out. You can follow through. A lot of times we're afraid of doing what God calls us to do because from our little tiny position of minuscule nano faith, it doesn't look like things are going to work out because all we do is look inside. No. When God asks you to do something, regardless what it means, whether to pray for an enemy or to forgive an unforgivable or to be generous or whatever it might be that God asks you to do, keep your mouth shut. Whatever it might be, and you know it's God asking you to do, why not just say, God, I'm going to do what you have told me to do in faith. I am going to trust you. I'm going to follow along your ways. I'm going to do what you call me to do. That's where I'm going to land. I'm going to land on that you do care about me. You are not asking me for no reason. You're asking me for a specific purpose. And I am going to be obedient to you. I'm going to follow through and I'm going to do what you ask me to do. Because I have faith that regardless of what all of my fears are, you are going to protect me. You are going to protect me. And after I've come through this, I'm going to look back on these days and I go, see, I did trust God. And God took care of me. God proved it all the way through. Man, that's a good way to live. That's the only way for us Christians to live is to engage ourselves with the Spirit of God in the spirit world and to understand that God controls everything. God's got all in his hands. And God's bringing it all together. You know, in our own lives as we seek these things, we come to this point in our lives. We come to this spot where we're really challenged to step out, and it's scary. I don't know when to do it. I'm afraid, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. Now, there's a name some of you might know, but many of you might not. And this guy's name was Jim Elliot. And this happened in the 50s, 1950s. And this guy inspired a generation of Christians to live for Jesus. And what happened to Jim Elliot was God, out of the blue, spoke to him and his wife and said, Jim, I want you to go and bring the gospel, bring my word, bring my name to the people who are living in the jungles of Ecuador, the Orani people. and nobody had ever gone there. They were known to be very, very violent people. And but Jim and his wife said, we'll go. We'll go do that. And they tried to do it right, and they got to Ecuador, learned the language, and met a few people, and learned a few words in Irani. And what they did, Jim was a pilot with Missionary Aviation Fellowship. And what they would do to kind of make contact with these people is they would fly their airplane in a tight circle, and they would lower a bucket on a rope. And in the bucket, they had tools and pots and pans and things to trade with these people. And sure enough, the people came out, and they took the things that were in the bucket, and then they would put some of their stuff, their crafts in there. And they did this, quite a while, and they felt that we've built a relationship. And so the next thing was, well, we're going to land the plane here on the river and meet these people one for one. Well, that didn't go as planned. And what happened was the Irani people came out and slaughtered Jim and his companions. And his wife was still at the base, and that was the end of that. His wife, Elizabeth Elliot, wrote a book about 2 years later, and she entitled the book, The Shadow of the Almighty. The Shadow of the Almighty. What does that mean? Well, it comes out of Psalm 91. It comes out of Psalm 91, and it begins, and the first two verses are, whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. I would say if you're facing an issue today and you're very afraid of something, read Psalm 91. Read the whole thing, but don't read it once. Read it over and over and over until it's not something that you're reading, it's something that you're saying. Until it just becomes a part of your soul. Until it becomes that this is what God has for me to say today. Psalm 91. But also hearing these verses and what Elizabeth Elliot, his widow, would say. She said, we found a secret place. And that secret place was not a place. It was not a location. The secret place that we found, the shadow of the Almighty, is a person. And that person is Jesus. And when you come to Jesus and you're in His presence, you find yourself in the safest place a human being could ever be. The safest place on earth is not into a fortress. The safest place a human being can be is not protected by everybody and no bad thing happening. No. The safest place where you and where I could be is in the presence of God. That's the safest place for every single one of us, in the presence of God. We are in the presence of God right now. We have come together to worship Jesus. We've come together to give Him honor. We've come together to seek Him. We are in the presence of God. And I'd like to take this up a notch. And what we're going to do is I'm going to invite the ushers to come forward and take the trays of the Lord's Supper, the bread and the cup. And without you guys coming forward, we're going to serve you. We're going to pass these trays down through the aisles here. And if you would take a cup, and if you would take a piece of that bread, that would be you in the presence of Jesus, doing what He asks you to do. We understand that in the communion is a sacrament. What does that mean? That means the very presence of God. This is what saves us. This is what gives us hope, is to be in the shadow of the Almighty. This is where it is. There's no safer place in this world than to be in the presence of God. So I invite you, as you take this and you receive it, hold the elements, hold the cup, hold the bread, and ask God to reveal His presence, that you would have a genuine encounter with God right now, so that you would know that you would know that you would know that God is with you, and that God cares for you, and that God has a plan for your life, that God has a way out for you, that God has a path to a better place. And then when you find that assurance, then on your own time, we're going to sing a beautiful song, but while you're listening to it, take the element, drink the cup, eat the bread, and enjoy this presence with Jesus. Enjoy this presence with Jesus. After we're done, and after we've sung the song, I would invite anybody here who would like to come up for personal prayer, to come and pray with somebody, a leader here, to come and pray for you. Is there something you're afraid of? Is there something that you're facing? Is it a child that you want to pray for? Is it a situation beyond your control? Is it an illness? Let us come and pray for the protection of God. Let us be here in the very presence of God.